Good morning and welcome to the 35th meeting in 2013 of the Health and Sport Committee. I point out to some here that although we give the usual warning, I've stopped giving that warning now. I was given a warning about not using blackberries and then making an announcement that people were using tablets. But obviously, phones, blackberries switched off. You will have noticed that some members are using tablets and other devices to refer to their papers. Could I, first of all, give a welcome to two other MSPs who have joined us today, Kevin Stewart and Jackie Bailey. Welcome. The first and only item on the agenda, of course, is to return to the issue of child poverty. Members will recall that we carried out visits in Glasgow, hosted by Save the Children in October and in November, and held a round table. And we can maybe bear that in mind in some of the questions that came up there with the ministers who have joined us this morning. And we have, of course, two Scottish ministers here with us today, two for the price of one. And I don't know how I'm going to, I don't know how I'm going to, Minister Margaret or whatever. We'll see how we go on there. But welcome to Margaret Burgess, Minister for Housing and Welfare. Welcome, Minister. And Aileen Campbell, Minister for Children and Young People. Welcome to you both. They're accompanied by Alex Young, Team Leader Tackling Poverty. Paul Tyler, Senior Principal Research Officer. Welcome. And Stuart Robb, Head of Policy Delivery, Early Years. Welcome to you all. We are pressed for time. We need to be out of here at 11:25 because we're not allowed to sit at the same time as business is taking place in the chamber. So if we can bear in mind those constraints. I believe that there are certainly opportunities there if the ministers wish to place a short statement on the record. But it looks as if we're pointing to you, Minister for Housing and Welfare. Is it? Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and for the opportunity to be here this morning and discuss child poverty in Scotland. I'm joined by my colleague Aileen Campbell, Minister for Children and Young People, who leads on the early years and is currently taking through Parliament the Children and Young People Bill. And I'm sure you will all agree that every child in Scotland deserves the best possible start in life, and none of us want to see any child condemned to a life of poverty. And while child poverty has fallen since devolution from 28% in 1999 to 2000 to 15% in 2011-12, it's still too high. And as you'll be aware, recent analysis suggests that by 2020, once all the UK government welfare reforms have come into effect, there will be around 50,000 to 100,000 more children living in poverty in Scotland than in 2011. And we don't have to accept this. The Scottish Government's White Paper, Scotland's Future, sets out why the people of Scotland are best placed to determine Scotland's future. Independence is about giving ourselves the power to make our country as good as it can be. It's about the ability to decide to make choices. Independence would give us the opportunity to design our own welfare system based on Scottish needs and priorities, a system which supports people who work, provides support for those who cannot work, and fosters social solidarity. A system founded in democracy, prosperity and social justice. Not only would we halt the rollout of universal credit and repeal the bedroom tax, but we would also deliver a transformational extension of childcare, making it easier for parents to return to work. In the meantime, we are doing what we can within our existing powers and resources to make Scotland a better place, and this includes protecting the most vulnerable and tackling child poverty. Our long-term approach to tackling child poverty is through early intervention and prevention. Our strategy focuses on the key aims of maximising household resources and improving children's well-being and life chances. We've reported annually on the strategy in the most recent report being published in September this year. The 2013 report highlights examples of projects undertaken by the Scottish Government, local government and third sector to address child poverty through actions across a range of areas, including employment, housing, regeneration, health, education and childcare. It includes increasing funding for early learning to up to 600 hours for 3- and 4-year-olds and all looked after 2-year-olds, an extra £9.2 million into the new Scottish Welfare Fund that can help families get essential household items, investing £40 million with local government in the council tax successor arrangement, providing an additional £7.9 million to improve access to advice, and just this week, we expanded our family nurse partnerships to give children born to young mothers, a healthier start to life. We're working with the Ministerial Advisory Group on Child Poverty, who many gave evidence to this committee last month. And stakeholders have raised a number of important issues with us, such as educational attainment and childcare, both of which will form a key part of our approach to tackling child poverty in the coming years. And what's more, following advice from the Ministerial Advisory Group, we will be introducing a child poverty performance framework into the refreshed strategy. This will enable the government and its partners to report on progress, and I hope the committee will find that useful in the coming years. We don't underestimate the scale of the task facing us. Tackling child poverty is and will continue to be challenging. The annual report outlines the work done in Scotland with our current powers, but it also highlights the significant impact that welfare reform is having and will continue to have. We will do all we can within our existing powers and resources to mitigate welfare reform and tackle child poverty. But as set out in Scotland's future, with the full powers of independence, Scotland can become a better and fairer place for our children. Thank you.
Thank you. Move directly to questions. Rhoda Grant. Take Buds thereafter.
Can I ask if you would give me a couple of practical examples of what you're doing to tackle child poverty?
There's a number of things that we've done. As I said initially, the key elements of the current strategy are maximising household incomes and increasing children's life chances and well-being. We're maximising household incomes by our social wage that the Scottish Government is key to the Scottish Government's commitments to the people of Scotland. The social wage does help families. It helps families in terms of everything that we're doing in the social wage, the council tax frees, the free prescriptions, free healthcare, all helps family and all helps children in poverty. The annual report outlined a number of other initiatives that the Scottish Government have taken with the third sector, in voluntary groups, and how we're tackling child poverty. The family nurse partnerships, which perhaps Ms Campbell might want to talk about later, is also in terms of tackling child poverty. We're looking at what we're doing in youth employment. It's long-term drivers of poverty that we'll have to tackle. This is a long-term process. We can't solve child poverty overnight. There's lots of complexity there around it, but the Scottish Government is focusing on it with our local government partners. Our Scottish Welfare Fund was specifically looking at families and children under pressure in terms of their household budgets, looking at increasing our childcare from 475 to up to 600 hours a year, which also improves families' budgets, but also allows women to get back into work, and we need to have people in quality jobs, and that's our commitment to the living wage, to ensure that work that is there is of the right length of time and of quality work, to ensure that we can take people out of poverty, because I'm quite sure you'll be aware of the recent report from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation that the number of people in work that are in poverty, and that's a concern to all of us. So we've got to ensure that the work is of the right type and is of quality work.
Can I just pick you up on one of those? You talked about the social wage being one of your policies to tackle poverty. Is it not the case that those in poverty would not be paying council tax, would not be paying prescriptions? Surely those are policies that help, maybe not the most well off, but certainly they don't help the least well off, because they wouldn't. There is no additional benefit for them.
I think there are additional benefits. I talked earlier about those in work, the number of people in work who are now in poverty, and the council tax reduction scheme that we've introduced with the local government partners. Had that not been introduced, the least well off, whether or not they were in benefit or low income, would be subject to a 10% increase. They would have to pay that 10% in their council tax had we not introduced that scheme. So that's one initiative. In terms of free prescriptions, many people working in low income were paying prescriptions, so they're benefiting from free prescriptions as well. So I do think that what we're doing in terms of the social wage is of a benefit to people on low incomes and those in poverty.
We're concentrating on child poverty at the moment, so it's those in poverty. You talked about performance indicators. Can I ask how you're going to measure your performance?
Okay, we're looking at developing a framework which at the moment has gone to the Ministerial Advisory Group to look at. It will be part of the refresh strategy. It links with other frameworks we have, and perhaps Paul here could maybe talk a bit. Paul, if you'd like to talk a bit about the strategy and what we're looking at overall in terms of our framework.
Yeah. I just want to take you back to September when we published the annual report, and then talk about where we are now, and perhaps talk very briefly about where we're going in the next few months. So in September,
and how you're going to measure it, and I know you report annually, but I'm just wanting to know, is the measurements going to be robust? What steps are you going to take to measure?
Yeah, well,
we're kind of short of time, so.
Just be a minute. But in September we said we recognised that the case study approach that the annual report was taking was fairly limited, had limitations, so we wanted to introduce a more analytical approach in future years. So what we've done now is we've sent, as the Minister said, an outcomes framework to the Ministerial Advisory Group. It makes explicit the thinking that underpins the child poverty strategy. So not just the activities and the long-term outcomes, but the short-term outcomes, the medium-term outcomes, and how all these join together and are interrelated. It also links to other strategies like the housing and regeneration outcomes that were published yesterday. And this outcome framework is going to structure the revised strategy when it's published next year. So that's where we are now. What we're doing in spring is we're going to develop this into a performance framework. So in a sense, you could see it like a mini Scotland Performs, a mini national performance framework. So indicators will be agreed with the Ministerial Advisory Group so that it will enable ministers to check progress, it will enable transparent and robust reporting, and it will hold the Scottish Government, enable you to hold the Scottish Government to account. So it's about identifying markers, if you like, in the sand to say, this is where we think we should be getting to, and if we don't get that far, then you can ask us about that. Is that helpful?
That is helpful, but I would be keen to know what kind of, you said outcomes, are those going to be very soft outcomes, or are they going to be measurable, and what data are they going to be measured against?
They've got to be measurable, and they've got to use national level data for the most part, and that will enable us using Scottish Government data as well. So it'll enable everybody to see how well we're doing over time.
Why haven't you been? I mean, I presume that you've seen the evidence from a round table with all of the people that we had round the table, and it just goes on, the need to have a clearer sense of progress, set out child property is built into strategies, interventions, but no analysis of impact, goes on and on. You obviously have taken that on board. If you're serious about this, why isn't that targeting, that spend, why haven't we been monitoring those outcomes? This is, you know, the language of government, that we don't measure inputs, we measure outcomes. Why haven't you been measuring outcomes and impacts?
There have been some measurement of what we're doing, but I think what we'd set up the ministerial task force to advise the ministers on how to best proceed. And the group, as you'll be aware, have attended your committee. They have said overall they believe that the strategy we have is the correct strategy and is the right way forward. But they did raise concerns about the case study approach, some of the analysis we're doing, and we've taken that on board, and that's what we're doing now. And I think we're putting this framework together. We'll be able to bring the framework to yourselves, to Parliament, to judge whether or not we're achieving what we're setting out to do. We're also commissioning some research at the start of the year to look at whether the activities that we're currently looking at are the most effective measures in helping us to deliver these outcomes. So we are putting a bit of work into this and taking this forward.
Though it's certainly no criticism of you, Minister, what we're talking about is historically why that wasn't part of, if we're serious about tackling child poverty and poverty, why that wasn't part of the package that examined the spend that we were putting in to these measures. It would be helpful also that we've had a list of measures and spend today that if we could get some totals of the spend that's actually tackling those aspects of child poverty. And one final question, who is the champion in the Scottish Cabinet for child poverty?
The Deputy First Minister is the champion for child poverty. Deputy First Minister champions child poverty.
Right.
But there is, clearly, and I think it's just to make, absolutely what Margaret has said, the Minister has said there. There is a cross-portfolio interest in this as well. And at Cabinet, for instance, I sit within the education team as well, and there's a number of issues and areas which the people who gave evidence last week talked about other areas of government which have an impact on child poverty. So there's absolutely a cross-portfolio interest as well in some of the areas of work that I'm taking forward around early years. The Children and Young People Bill have an impact on our wider approach to dealing and tackling child poverty. But absolutely, as Margaret says, the welfare and poverty rests with the DFM, and but we all have an interest, and we're all very keen to make sure that we make inroads into child poverty. Like
clearly, the point I'm making is when everybody's responsible, no one is clearly.
I would say that the Deputy First Minister also chairs the ministerial task group on child poverty. It is an absolute priority for this government. And that's the level we've taken it to, and 3 ministers sit on that task force, and we are listening and taking the advice of the experts on that group as well. Yeah,
it may be that it should have been that Cabinet Secretary that was here this morning. Maybe I don't know how we arrived at that. If she's clearly for.
I understand she's at another committee.
Oh right, that's fine.
So we both Margaret is the deputy chair for the task force, and I attend as well. So again, that reflects the wider cross-portfolio interest that we have as a government in terms of tackling child poverty. And I think, the fact that we both want to contribute to the work that the committee is doing in terms of examining this very important issue, regardless of party, I think, that's a positive thing. Although
I accept that, and I don't mean any offence to the ministers that are with us this morning, but the person who fights for a slice of the budget is on the Cabinet. In respect to the failure to measure the outcomes and accept the concern of people who gave us evidence, why didn't we? I'm addressing my remarks to Mr Tyler, who seems to be the person that is now going to have a strategy for measuring outcomes, but who was the person who failed to have that type of scrutiny? Are they with us today? I see you looking over there, but you're getting no help. You're getting no help. I'm afraid you're ahead.
Well, I can only speak for myself. So I've been in post for a year, and one of the priorities for me coming in was to look at this and to see if we could encourage more robust reporting. But I would say we obviously have the 2010 Child Poverty Act 4 targets. Well, 3 have been set and 1's going to be set around child poverty. And those are, in a sense, overarching ways of measuring how we're doing on child poverty in Scotland.
We'll push you on to Malcolm.
To say the way in which you've characterised that, I don't necessarily agree with, because actually child poverty has reduced over the whole course of devolution as well. And so I think to suggest in the way that you have that there hasn't been a robust way of monitoring some of that progress is inaccurate. But I think what the advisory group is telling us is that we need to kind of drill down a wee bit further, and absolutely that's why we're developing a much more robust way of monitoring that progress as we move forward.
Yes, Minister. I didn't see it. The people who are members of your task group said it. They gave it to us in evidence, and it's reflected in our notes. They are saying that there's no. They are saying all of these things. So I don't know why it's taken, a committee hearing to bring this out. If you were talking to them and talking to them in the task group, I'm sure they must have told you that the task group that there needs to be a better understanding of what's locally, that we need to measure outcomes, we need to have targets.
We know we measure outcomes, but that's exactly why, as Paul and the Minister have told you, is that that's why we're, on the advice of the advisory group, we're moving forward by making sure that we have a robust mechanism to analyse.
Sin and repents, Malcolm.
Continue on the same theme. I mean, I welcome the fact there's going to be a performance framework, and I mean, just briefly to repeat, I suppose what the convener says, certainly the absence of a measurement framework featured quite strongly in the roundtable. And for example, in some of the written evidence, I'll just take one example. One Parents Families Scotland said there needed to be a more consistent and transparent approach to monitoring and evaluation with specific concrete targets and timelines. So I don't know if you could say anything about evaluation and targets and timelines. Would that be part of the performance framework?
Yes, I think is the short answer to that. We'll be using evaluation evidence to determine, to some extent, how we're doing with particular outcomes where there isn't national level data. So we will be looking to do that. Where we're funding fairly small pots, fairly small services, we'll be looking to encourage organisations to take forward self-evaluation so that they're learning about the services they deliver and how they can be improved as they develop them. So, yeah.
I mean, another point that was made was the absence of a delivery plan, and I suppose the other more general point, which is perhaps more controversial and difficult, is the sense that there was a lack of a national strategy, and partly because of the view that was taken of local government. For example, it was pointed out that SOAs don't make reference to a national strategy on child poverty. By the way, I've heard some of this at the Finance Committee as well, so I may be getting confused whether I heard this at the Finance Committee or the Health Committee, but it doesn't really matter because the evidence was certainly given about that. And also, for example, that there was no guidance to community planning partnerships on this. So I think the sense came across, I think both here and what I heard at the Finance Committee, that an awful lot of this was left to the discretion of local government. And of course, related to that, which certainly came up at our round table, was organisation after organisation saying that there has to be a statutory duty on local authorities to take action on child poverty, because if there isn't that, you do end up with this very uneven picture about the priority given to child poverty by different local authorities. So the preference of the organisations that we heard was for a statutory duty, but I suppose I'm offering you a fallback position. If there isn't a statutory duty, can there at least be, you know, a requirement within strategic outcome agreements, guidance to community planning partnerships, and whatever other devices are available to the government in terms of ensuring that local government delivers national priorities?
Well, certainly, you know, looking at the community planning partnership and the single outcome agreements, building child poverty more into the agreement and to the guidance that we produce for them. And the single outcome agreements, the new agreements signed, do focus on priorities: employment, early years, health inequality, safer communities, physical activity. And all of these are key in childcare and the route into employment. All of these are key in tackling child poverty. And that's what we anticipate the community partnerships will address. They also have to report on that annually. They have to report on their activities, and they have to work with local government to ensure that they're meeting the national priorities, of which child poverty is one. We also looked and did consider the approach of the statutory duty, but Robert Nicholl, who's the COSLA representative on our task force, said very much that he doesn't agree that that's the right approach, and at this stage we think that's possibly the correct way, because we have to look at ensuring that we're not limiting how others who may be involved in the child poverty strategy and work in child poverty and the wider community planning partnerships. So the way we're looking at taking it forward just now is through the community planning partnerships with single outcome agreements. But what I would say to all of what we're doing just now and we want to strengthen community planning. All of what we're doing in terms of the framework, the evaluation, the monitoring, that will be done working with the ministerial task force of the people who came round this committee last month. All of those, and the committee will have input into that, into the final framework when it's produced, and how the evaluation takes place. And they will also be looking over our shoulder as well, and quite rightly, to ensure that we deliver on what we say we're doing.
Just one final point, if that's all right, Convener. I mean, I suppose another theme that came through, and it's related to that idea of evaluation, is, you know, let's evaluate and do the things that we have evidence actually work. And again, that kind of related in the discussion with the whole issue of national and local, because the feeling was that some of these really effective national initiatives were getting lost. I mean, an example that was given by Douglas Hamilton, I think, but actually by others, but I remember he spoke very highly of working for families, which was certainly something that I was involved with in my time, but I'm not mentioning it for that reason particularly, but it was referred to as a really good national initiative in terms of helping to get parents into good, worthwhile jobs with support, particularly at the transition to employment. And I think that's kind of, well, it's not there as a national initiative. There may be some traces of it in some local authorities, I don't know. And so there is that sort of sense that we have lost some of these good national initiatives. And I wonder, you know, how you can capture that and ensure that those things that really work are the things that people invest in.
That's part of, I think, what we said earlier that we were doing, and looking at how the framework deals with the organisations such as the one you described, that I think all of us would agree that they do deliver, and it's an excellent service funded by and receives funding from the Scottish Government. So it's looking at how they can evaluate with us, assisting them in the framework and fit it all in, and there's all the various strands of it, the local strands, the national strands, what is working, what's not working, and it may form part of what we're looking at in commissioning research about the activities that we should be looking at. We want to make sure that nothing is left out here, and that's why we're looking at further research on that.
And can I add, Convener, as well, and Malcolm Chisholm will know as well, because of the work that we've done in the earlier task force, that very much a lot of the emphasis there is around evidence-based approaches, and that being set and influenced by the experts and practitioners that sit around the table to guide some of the policies that we take forward. And I just wanted to add as well some of the opportunities that present themselves with the Children and Young People Bill around how we kind of can put together detailed guidance around how we move forward children's services plans at that strategic planning level. So there'll be opportunities there to work with other stakeholders, including, for instance, Child Poverty Action, the Child Poverty Action Group, to consult with them to develop the robust guidance to allow us to monitor and evaluate the developments in local authorities. So I think there's opportunities there as well with the bill, which hasn't yet passed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mike, Malcolm. Aileen?
Convener, and good morning to both of our ministers. Ministers, you've outlined some of the initiatives and measures that that you're obviously taking forward to reduce child poverty levels in Scotland, but of course there are very real concerns that such progress is being made all the harder and all the more challenging by the damaging Westminster welfare reform cuts that are hitting some of the most poorest and most vulnerable families and children. And I just wanted to ask around how do you think, how you see the Westminster welfare reform cuts impacting on the child poverty levels in Scotland? I mean, obviously we heard evidence from John Dickey at the committee a couple of weeks ago from the Child Poverty Action Group, who said that there would be, as a result of the UK tax and benefits policy, there will be massive rises in child poverty. And I know that you mentioned earlier the key statistic that in Scotland alone, between 50,000 and up to 100,000 more children living in Scotland in poverty by 2020. So it's just to kind of see how do you, sort of think that's going to have an impact on our child poverty levels in Scotland?
I mean, it presents, the welfare reforms present a real challenge. Clearly, when we've got figures coming out that 50,000 more children, and that's the minimum figure, it's between 50 and 100,000 more children in Scotland in child poverty by 2020. it's actually quite frightening that we could be in that position. We're doing what we can within our existing powers to mitigate the welfare reform cuts we have. As I said earlier, the Scottish Welfare Fund, we've topped it up by £9.2 million to keep it at that level for the next 2 years. The money for the council tax reduction scheme, we've given money to advice services. There's a number of issues of what we're doing, helping housing organisations, groups. We fund a number of organisations dealing in child poverty to try and address this, but the reality is we can't mitigate all the impacts of the UK government welfare reforms. We're doing what we can within our existing powers, and I think what we've spelled out in terms of Scotland's future is the way forward, in my view, to reduce child poverty in Scotland, to give us flexibility over our own resources, to immediately stop the bedroom tax, which impacts on children, not just where the parents are struggling to find the money for the bedroom tax, but I also think it goes against everything that we look for when children are being siloed into a certain size of room, which we all know the more space a child has, the better for them. They've been tried to be forced into a certain size of room against what we want to do in housing, simply because their parents are poor, and that's unacceptable to me, and it's something that we certainly wouldn't have in an independent Scotland. The universal credit, we've only seen some of the welfare reforms so far, and we've seen the impact of what we've had so far. There's many more coming down the line, and there's problems we're having with sanctions and benefits, the impact that's having in families with children. So the universal credit, the impact, the way it's paid is going to have on women in Scotland who tend to, or women across the board, who tend to be the ones who manage the finances and make sure the money goes to where it should go in terms of child benefit and the expenditure. So there's lots of areas there that we're very concerned about, and we're looking. We will mitigate where we can to prevent any more children get into poverty, but we cannot deal with what's coming from the UK government in terms of the welfare reforms and the projections of what we see is going ahead for future years.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Minister. I mean, what more would you like to do? You know, if this Parliament had, the powers over the key levers such as tax and welfare.
Well, I would be absolutely, if this Parliament had control over its welfare spending, we could align it to our housing policy. We could ensure that there is not such a thing as a bedroom tax. We would be absolutely grow our own economy, because it's about growth, it's recovery, it's about the promotion we have of the living wage. I mean, it seems to me a nonsense when we have a national minimum wage that people can't live on. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. We have to make sure that the work we have is quality work. We can diversify our schemes we have for young people, for women. We're doing a lot. There's more women in work now in Scotland than were 4 years ago. There were more women going into work now in Scotland, and we've got to encourage that. The childcare, as we talked about earlier, all of these things, because I think it was mentioned by someone earlier on, child poverty doesn't sit in its own, it's extremely, poverty itself is very complex, child poverty is very complex, and it's about tackling all the areas of it that we can do, and I don't think we can do that holistically without having control of our own finances and economy.
Thanks very much.
Just on these, the employment issue, and so there would be some interest in, I'm sure you noticed it from the business community at the round table, and that representative was raising this whole issue about engagement with employers, developing the ethical employer. I know this is only a strand, and the big issues you mentioned, have a big impact, and there's broad agreement about how we should be dealing with that. But in terms of the living wage, the development of the workforce, training, what engagement takes place on a similar level with business that takes place with the task force, so that we are challenging them to be an ethical employer, pay the living wage, train, support, sustainable jobs? Because part of the problem we've got now, the rise in poverty, is indeed sadly those who are in work but can't escape benefits or can't create sustainable jobs or security in jobs. what is the Scottish Government doing to engage with that group of employers?
We have a number of engagements throughout portfolios with business, but Jane Wood, who I think you're referring to there, sits on our task force on poverty. She's part of the Ministerial Task Force on Poverty to bring that aspect of it to inform us, because we recognised absolutely that was important as well. We have to get business, we have to encourage business. The Scottish Government is promoting the living wage. We have to do it. We have to make employers feel good about paying the living wage as well, being accredited to do it. And I think all of that is important, and we have to get more people on board.
It may be something you can take up when you're thinking about the strategy, because I just thought it was worthwhile about a real focus on business and you know, their brand in some of these big employers, that they're treating people fairly.
Add to that as well, you know, in addition to Jane Wood sitting on the advisory group there on child poverty, the task force has had a refresh as well, the early years task force, sorry, convener, and we're very keen to engage in the business community there too. And one, albeit, you know, it's one small area in which we can point to where we've tried to engage with employers in terms of how flexible we can allow their employees to work, has been through sponsoring an award at the Institute of Directors to highlight and champion the fact that if you allow your workforce to work flexibly, that helps with childcare. It also boosts morale. And also John Swinney and myself hosted a summit on flexible working and trying to engage with businesses, small businesses, others as well, bigger, larger corporate entities too. So there has been a number of ways in which we have proactively engaged with the business community to try and point them in the direction to show that they can have an input and they can have an impact on some of the wider kind of societal problems that we're all grappling with. And Jane Wood, I think, is a very good advocate of how businesses do actually want to be part of that discussion and want to contribute to that wider agenda. But certainly the task force is looking to have more business representatives. We've sponsored that award last year, I forget, but however, I think it's a good example of where we can try and make inroads to that business community that you talk about.
Listen to hear, hopefully that will benefit from the refresh as well. And we've now got Colin.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Partially answered a question earlier on, but one thing that really stuck in my mind, obviously, most of the work that has been done, it's quite historical over a number of months and years. We've just had the autumn statement that's come out. Is there anything that came out in that autumn statement that you know, the task force or the likes have turned around and said, well, we have to really rethink something, because this is something that has gone beyond what we thought would have been happening? How bad could it be, if you like, that's made you actually rethink your strategy?
The current strategy that we have, that we're refreshing?
The autumn statement that's just come out, is there anything that's made you stop and think we have to do something extreme here because it's just gone beyond what we thought was possible?
Well, I think in terms of the autumn statement, in terms of the austerity measures and in terms of the cap and the total all expenditure and welfare does cause us concern. A number of things in the autumn statement cause us concern, but in terms of child poverty, it is just that for me, the relentless attack on the welfare state, which in benefits, which is not helping those trying to get back into the workplace, nor is it helping those who are stuck in the benefit system. That support's not there for them. So that's, for me, what comes out of the UK autumn statement. In terms of what we here will do, it just reinforces my commitment, that, you know, my absolute belief that we need to have control of our own resources and our own welfare state to ensure that we can have policies that are flexible to meet the needs of Scotland and to get child poverty down and not see this increase in child poverty that we know and the UK government is not denying is coming.
Thanks, Colin. Bob Doris.
Thanks, Convener. I was looking at Citizens Advice Scotland's briefing on welfare reform ahead of this morning's committee, and they gave a couple of figures. First of all, they were talking about 12,000 families who are worse off due to working tax credit reforms, up to £2,600 per year. They also mentioned child tax credit reforms. Over 73,000 families worse off by around £545 a year on average. In terms of working relationships with the UK government, would the UK government give you the information of the families that have had an income shock because of UK government reforms, which puts less money into the pockets of vulnerable families? Would they give you that information?
We get some information from them. Paul, do you know if we get that information?
I didn't hear the last bit of your question, I'm sorry.
CAS have identified, they estimate around 12,000 families will be worse off due to working tax credit reforms, and they estimate that over 73,000 families due to child tax credit reforms. Is the data on who these families are? I know there's confidentiality issues there, but is the data for who these families are and where these families are, is that made available via DWP to the Scottish Government to give you a better idea of where the UK Government is pushing people further into child poverty?
I think what we'll need to do is come back to the committee on that.
Okay. Well, the reason for asking that question is because what I'm trying to actually tease out is what the Scottish Government's doing to be proactive to tackle child poverty. So I'd written down, for example, family nurse partnerships, I'd written down the Early Years Collaborative, I'd written down the Third Sector Early Intervention Fund, 3 proactive measures to tackle child poverty, but there's also a series of mitigation measures that the Scottish Government is trying to put in. And what I'm just trying to establish is what the balance is in the Scottish Government strategy, because I'm conscious that every pound that you put into mitigating the issues created by welfare reform and directly impacting on child poverty is a pound that the Scottish Government can't spend being proactive to take children and lift children out of child poverty. So could the ministers perhaps give me some idea of the balance between those two spends? How much money are we putting into mitigating welfare reform rather than spending that money and actually lifting children out of child poverty? In other words, stopping things getting worse rather than improving things.
You mentioned some of the areas around the childcare. I think was one of the areas that has been presented itself at the committee. I think last month when you heard from the people who were given evidence, and certainly that's a fairly hefty amount of money that's accompanying that first step in towards transforming childcare. So that's money there that we're wanting to do to try and support families, and that will save families on average £700, around £700 per year per child. So that's something that we're doing, which along the lines that Margaret Burgess outlined as part of our approach to maximise household budgets. That's a very proactive step towards helping families protect their household budgets. But you hit the nail on the head there. While we're doing these things, at the same time, these external forces are really significantly impacting upon families as well. Which is why, while we're doing all we can in terms of early intervention, the Early Years Collaborative that you pointed to, which is about trying to evidence-base the small-scale changes before you ramp that up to allow young people to have fulfilling lives and positive outcomes. A lot of the work that we are doing does get impacted upon by the wider welfare reforms that are happening and the attack on particularly families and children. So, while we can do what we can to protect the well-being of children and give them the best possible start in life with the powers and tools that we have, ultimately, if poverty figures are going to go up as a result of welfare reform, then a lot of that work can be undone. Because the white paper outlines why poverty is a barrier to educational attainment. So, while we have competency over education, while we don't have responsibility over tax and welfare, that means a lot of the work that we're doing gets undone because we don't have the tools to tackle some of the issues around poverty. So, those are the examples you provide there are good examples of proactive work that the government's doing. But ultimately, if we don't have all the tools to tackle poverty, then some of that work and outcomes gets undone.
I just very briefly, convener, because with a similar discussion over budgets when doing health budget scrutiny and looking at health inequalities, and we found that the Scottish Government's budget line on health inequalities didn't actually capture all the monies that was been spent tackling health inequalities. How does the Scottish Government, or is there still work to be done in actually capturing all the spend across national government and local government investing in tackling child poverty? Because I'm not sure there's a clear picture of that because of the, as the convener was pointing out, the cross-portfolio approach to tackling child poverty. Do you think maybe there's more we can do to capture the overall spend? Because to capture the overall spend is quite important to then measure against the outcomes, and I'm delighted that there's going to be closer scrutiny on the ground to see what local authorities are actually doing to tackle child poverty. Perhaps there's not been as much of a light shone upon that as there previously should have been.
Well, I think you're right to reflect that there is a complexity there about trying to analyse some of the figures because of the kind of cross-portfolio nature of the spend. And one area I can point to, for instance, is the Early Years Change Fund, which is about bringing partners together and to sit, at a community planning partnership level, bringing people around the table together to talk about how they can collectively use the totality of their spend, in this instance in the early years, and how they can get the most out of that money. So that's a £272 million change fund, of which the government contributes 50 million, and of which that is administered by the Early Years Task Force. So that's about bringing partners together to realise that in terms of the public don't see that demarcation line about where public finances come from. They just want to know that they're going to receive a service, and a good quality service. So the task force is one proactive way about bringing people together, and at the individual community planning partnership level, they're getting around the table to talk about how they can use that money in the best way. And it's fairly early stages with some of those outcomes, but certainly there is that relationship with the task force that we can get some of the a review from some of the local authority community planning partnerships back about what they've been using and what they've been changing to impact upon the early years of a child's life. So I think that's fairly tangible example of one way to maximise the totality of spend across a variety of different agencies.
Very helpful, thank you, Convener. Thank you, Minister.
Gil Patterson.
Thanks very much. Good morning, Ministers. I want to talk about gender equalities, or maybe it's a lack of equalities in this regard. It's obviously an uphill battle. It's a battle that we've, in this Parliament, we've been fighting since its inception. But you seem to get up halfway up the hill and you get knocked back down again. So I want to kind of put my questions in regard to the welfare reform and tie it in together. And we know that that women will lose out because of how the universal credit system is structured, with single monthly payments to one member of the household. Now, I think we know that in many cases that's likely to be the male partner in a household. And so if that is the case, what impact is this likely to have on the policy that this Parliament has and this Government have on gender equalities?
I think that's absolutely right, and I think I referred to that earlier. With universal credit, the payment will go to one individual, and even the DWP have said that they anticipate that in very, I think they've given a figure, the percentage that will go to the male, and there is a real concern about that in terms of child poverty, because there is evidence that says that when the money goes to the mother of the child, then the money will go directly to that child and will be spent for the purposes it's made for. And we've said clearly as a government that we would halt the rollout of universal credit after independence, because we don't think it's working right. But it's suitable for Scotland, it's not fit for purpose. But we clearly have made these points to the DWP, and will continue to do so, that we don't think it's right that universal credit should be paid to one member of a household. We also think there's a number of other issues in universal credit, the way it's proposed, that is going to impact adversely on women, and the earnings disregard as well, that it could impact against women, because it weakens the incentive for a second earner in the household. So that does cause us concern, and we are looking at the impacts of what could happen down the road with universal credit. But I think we all know that it's been delayed considerably in the UK as a whole, but we still have concerns the way it's proposed, and I think that you've highlighted one of them there about going to one person in the household, and I just don't think that's at all satisfactory.
I think there's a whole series of measures that's likely to impact on women in particular. And of course, if it impacts on women, it's going to impact surely on children. So there's, I mean, everything, these are bedfellows in the true sense of the word, the impact it has in poverty and then it reaches children. So I wonder if you've had dialogue with the government and in London, and what kind of attitude are they taking? Are they sympathetic, or is there any movement at all in that regard, or are you having dialogue? That's probably the question I should ask you.
We certainly have had dialogue and continue in dialogue with the UK government on any measure that we think would be adversely affect people of Scotland and the children of Scotland. And one of them, we have raised everything, the benefit freezing, the changing from the RPI to the CPI, the removal of the baby element of child tax credits, the requirement for people in income support to sign on when their youngest child is 5 to move on to JSA, the universal credit, the payment to one person in the family, the bedroom tax. We continue. I mean, while I've set out what we would do with control of our own powers, we continue to make the case very strongly with the UK government about how we believe the impact of their reforms are having on the people of Scotland and in our children, and I will continue to do that. We won't give up on that. However, there has been, I think it'd be fair to say, there has been little give from the UK government in any of the requests that we've made.
You're aware that we've got the Secretary of State for Scotland coming in, and you've already answered a similar question I'm going to pose to you in regard of how you mitigate or what action you've been taking to mitigate against child poverty. I wonder, in relation to, particularly to gender inequalities, if you could, it would be helpful to tell us what measures you've taken specifically on gender equalities and get it on the public record.
I think overall, in terms of the gender inequalities, we've highlighted these issues. We've been very clearly, we've taken a number of initiatives in terms of the STUC conference and the Women in Work. I think as well in terms of what we're doing in childcare, increasing the hours for childcare is to reduce inequalities, to get more women into work. We, in our training places, the college places, encourage women to get into work. So we're doing a lot that we can within our powers to get women back into work and to try and narrow that gender inequality. However, with what the UK government are doing in terms of benefits and the working tax credits, and also in terms of the childcare element of working tax credits, reducing that as well, reducing the taper for working tax credits, when in the main it was the women who got the working tax credit. All of that is going against what we're trying to do here in Scotland.
I think specifically pointing to the work we're doing within the Children and Young People Bill around the increase in hours of early learning and childcare up to 600 hours, that will predominantly have an impact upon women who are looking after those young children. And while in itself the increase in hours is a good thing, the way in which the key to enabling women to access training and employment is that this is going to be delivered in a flexible way to allow women to access those opportunities far easier. Now, it's only one of the first part in the journey towards the transformation of childcare, and we've set out our ambitions within the white paper, but certainly that will have a practical make a practical difference, positive difference to women as well. And the Minister's right to point to the work that not only happens within my portfolio or Margaret Burgess's portfolio, but the fact that Angela Constance has done an awful lot of work about women and getting women into work through that STUC conference and the discrete portfolio interest that Shona Robeson has in particular around equalities shows that this is about working right across government to ensure that women's issues and the agenda is far further up the political agenda.
I'm sorry, Gil, we're under real pressure. I've got 3 to go, and it means it's going to impact. If I could have your indulgence, please. Thanks very much. Nanette?
To do with education, I mean, I think it's seems fairly clear to me that in long term, to break the cycle of poverty, you've got to educate people, young people coming up, to be fit for the workplace and improving their employability. And it was pointed out by our round table thing that we really need to look at long-term effects of an educational achievement gap, and that there's a significant difference between the Scottish strategy in Wales and Northern Ireland, that there is no reference to an attainment gap in schools within the Scotland strategy. Would you like to comment on that?
Thank you. And I guess this evidence session is quite timely given last week's PISA results, which showed that Scotland was one of the only areas in the UK to make that reduce that attainment gap as well. So I think what we're doing, some of the actions that we're taking in government is bearing fruit, and that reduction in the attainment gap between some of the most deprived children and those from other areas is a positive thing that we can point to as having making a tangible difference. And moving forward, you know, there will be the curriculum for excellence will be coming through those children who were assessed during the PISA study were a tranche of young people who weren't going through curriculum for excellence. So, you know, the fact that that's about ensuring that young people are effective learners, good contributors to society, these things will positively benefit young people and their attainment moving forward. And of course, my colleague Alistair Allen and Mike Russell will be developing the benchmarking tool so that schools can look to see a comparator school in a similar area, potentially from a similar area of deprivation, and look to see where they're comparing so that they can enable themselves to move forward and to attain greater levels for their young people. So I think those are some quite positive, quite tangible areas where we're making real progress in terms of closing that attainment gap, borne fruit through the PISA study last week, but also moving forward, not resting on our laurels and not taking the foot off the gas in terms of ensuring that young people get the life chances that they deserve and allow their educational attainment to flourish.
About sort of skills mismatch in Scotland. I mean, I obviously come from an area where the oil and gas energy industry is very, very short of skills. I mean, really seriously wanting skills. And there are other parts of Scotland where the skills currently are not there. And I think there has to be some means of joining that up. And I think that would eventually break the cycle. I'm not saying it would happen tomorrow, but break the cycle of childhood poverty.
And there are some, you know, the Wood Commission, which reported a few months ago, there are opportunities there to make sure that we do focus on where we have that potential skills gap. So there's been the college reforms, there's been other ways, the other work that my colleague Angela Constance is doing about trying to make sure that young people are given the tools that they need to get into and access the job opportunities that are presenting themselves, some of which you've highlighted. So there is an awful lot of work going forward, and if you want further information, you know, by all means, you know, given the time constraints, convener, if you want any of my colleagues to write to you with some of that, then that would be an offer that I'm sure they would greatly take up.
Appreciate that, Minister. Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Convener, and I know we're short of time, so I'll be brief. I want to return to the local government aspect of poverty strategies, particularly in terms of single outcome agreements and the involvement of community planning partnerships. Having not long ago been a councillor in Aberdeen City, where we initiated a poverty strategy which was championed by Jim Kiddie and tried to embed that in everything that we did. Can I ask if your COSLA representative on your task force is looking for best practice that already exists in local authorities, and whether that can be exported right across the board rather than seeing the reinventing of the wheel, which we often do?
Yes, we would anticipate that would be the case, and when we're forming our guidance, it will be part of, we're looking at the best practice to ensure that, the colleague in the task force we would hope would be part of that, to look at what is going on out there, where it is working well. We've always said that we don't want to reinvent the wheel. If something is working, let's look at it and see if we can spread it out through other CPPs.
I would just highlight as well the opportunities within the bill as well to kind of the joint planning between local authorities and health boards as well provides another opportunity. And I think when I was at the Kevin Stewart's committee, we talked about some of the good examples that already exist in terms of CPPs reporting on activities around early years. I think West Lothian had been one, Aberdeen I think had been another, and the Early Years Collaborative is fostering that approach, the approach that when local authorities and the wider community planning partnerships can get together and share best practice, that's in an open environment with and allows those CPPs to share best practice and to then replicate it if it's appropriate, or to maybe monitor how they can maybe improve some of their actions. So there are lots of ways in which sharing best practice can move.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Convener. And I think we all share a sense of impatience and frustration that we're not making more progress on child poverty for whatever reason. But I think we need to acknowledge the context that from 1997 to 2007 showed the greatest falls in child poverty. Indeed, the rate of child poverty in Scotland was lower than anywhere else in the United Kingdom. And since then, it's largely flatlined. So, like the Convener, I very much welcome the performance framework. We've operated without one for 3 to 4 years now. We've operated without a delivery plan. We've operated without targets. And therefore, we have effectively put tackling child poverty on pause for years. So I very much welcome the renewed focus on it. On the basis of that renewed focus, can you advise me, Minister, whether you will be now going back to the budget, because from 2007 till now, you've stripped almost £1 billion out of anti-poverty strategies in the budget. And that would be one absolutely fantastic way of reinforcing your commitment to tackling child poverty that would support the refreshed strategy.
Just a couple of points there. I disagree absolutely. Child poverty has not been imposed from the Scottish Government for the last 4 years or at any time. It has not been imposed, and tackling child poverty is a priority. In terms of the budget, we have not stripped money from the budget. The financial inclusion money, which is, I presume, what Ms Bailey is talking about, was rolled into the local government settlement to allow local government more flexibility in how to target locally what they were doing in terms of anti-poverty measures, and is being used in many areas that community planning partnerships in some areas have that money to tackle their anti-poverty measures, but the money was not cut from the budget. It was rolled in, the ring fencing was removed.
Provide the Minister with a full list of where all the budget lines have been impacted, particularly on anti-poverty measures, if that would help raise the budget. But can I move on to this constant theme that appears to be emerging, which is whether you have the power or not? It strikes me that in childcare, I think we would all agree is fully devolved. You can do it now. You have the power to do it now. You have consequentials from the autumn budget statement. So can I ask the Minister for Children and Young People why that isn't happening now?
We have set a quite ambitious aspiration for childcare within the White Paper, and taken the first step within the Children and Young People Bill up to 600 hours. And I did notice from Joanne Lamont's speech that she gave to the party conference in spring that she talked about things around maternity leave and paternity leave, around that being key to transforming childcare, both things which we don't have competency over. So even within the Labour's own narrative, they are talking about areas in which we have no responsibility. But the point is, within the White Paper, that we will recoup the tax returns from enabling women to get into work through the aspirations that we have to transform childcare. Those tax returns don't come to us at the moment. Those go straight to Westminster. So by having the full competency of powers to deliver the transformation in childcare that we certainly want, I don't know whether the Labour Party have managed to come up with any ideas yet about how they would move childcare forward. I think, judging by the exchanges we see at First Minister's questions, there seems to be a vacuum there in terms of what your ideas are as a party. We are doing what we can with the powers that we have, and with the powers of independence, we will be able to improve the life chances of children across Scotland.
Can I say, Convener, that was such a disappointing response, because there are women and families out there now desperate for childcare. Labour have led the way on a lot. Please don't interrupt, Minister.
Minister?
On People are desperate for childcare now. You have the power and the money to do it, and I'm disappointed you're not doing it. My final question, Convener, is on bedroom tax, and I would like to direct it to the Minister for Housing and Welfare. Again, this is an area where you could support a Members' Bill that will protect people from evictions. You have the power to do that. You have the power to put in place the additional 30 million on top of the 20 million you've made available, which is truly welcome. At the moment, you're refusing to do that, and people are left wondering why that is, because we genuinely, people are facing rent arrears that they can't cope with, and they're looking for the Scottish Government to provide a lead.
The Scottish Government has provided £20 million to top up discretionary housing payments, which is the only way that we can help individuals having difficulties with their rent. That £20 million takes 7 out of 10 people out of the bedroom tax immediately, right away. 7 out of 10 are removed from the bedroom tax with that funding. And I think it is incorrect to suggest that there is another legal way that the Scottish Government can assist people with rent payments. We are assisting where we can. We took action. We took action very early on in our opposition to the bedroom tax. We very early on said that we would repeal it in an independent Scotland. It was 6 months later before any other party was prepared to even say that. We've put our money where we believe it was the right thing to do. We listened to the arguments put forward by Shelter about looking at a way that we could assist individuals with their rent payment. And that's the only legal way that we can do it, is through discretionary housing payments. But of course, discretionary housing payments, again, are a reserved matter. And being a reserved matter, the UK Government puts a limit into how much the Scottish Government can contribute. And that's what we have done. But that has been in addition to all the other mitigation measures we've taken in welfare reform. And I think that this Government has taken that action. And I also think the public absolutely understand that what we have done is helping them.
And on the point of healthcare, absolutely, we are listening to parents, and that's why we're taking forward a very substantial step forward in the children and young people bill. I am in charge of this committee, and I've got enough issues around about the table. I'm sure we're all anxious, and I said right at the beginning, it's got heated and political at the end, and that's fine. But I am asking for the indulgence of the committee members who would like to come back in, that we have got a session now with the Scottish Secretary of State dealing with some of these issues. We've got to 11:25. I'm sure he would be delighted if he's only got 15 minutes with this committee. And if that's what we want to do, I'll take you back in, Minister, and I'll take other members. Do you have an agreement to move to end this session? Thank you very much. Thank you for your attendance this morning.
Convene and continue our session on child poverty. Can I welcome the Right Honourable Alistair-Carmichael MP, Secretary of State for Scotland. Welcome. Sandra Fordyce, Child Poverty Unit, and Fordyce, Child Poverty Unit, and James Wolfe, Department of Work and Pensions UK Government. Welcome to you all. Secretary of State, you wish to give some opening remarks before we move to questions?
I think, if I may, Mr Chairman, that would be helpful. And can I first of all thank you for the invitation to come here. In all my years as a backbencher at Westminster, I have preached the sermon about greater interaction between Scots at Westminster and this Parliament, so I now hope to be able to put some of that preaching into practice. You've already referred to my two minders for the day. I would expect to field most of the questions myself, but occasionally in points of technicality and detail, I'll bring them in. I should also say that if it assists the committee as you consider this matter further, then Sarana and James will both be more than happy to assist with the provision of any information or data that you require as you go forward. So, I am grateful for the opportunity to discuss the issue of child poverty. I understand that you're carrying out what you consider to be a short, sharp investigation as part of a wider scrutiny of health inequalities in Scotland. I hope it is useful to share the UK Government's views on the issues, including in relation to our own reserved responsibilities. Tackling child poverty is one of those issues that I am sure everybody in this room is signed up to. Child poverty is an affront, and we, all of us, want to address that. Dealing with it goes to the heart of what we mean when we talk about a fairer society. To tackle it, we need to bridge the attainment gap in education. We need to deal with health inequalities. We need to improve the quality of our housing stock. We need to improve employability and respond to the pressures of in-work poverty, all of which are inextricably linked by the state of our economy. It does strike me, Mr Chairman, and it has struck me in the last few days as I've prepared to come here to you today, that there must be greater opportunity for cooperation at a formal level between the UK Government and the Scottish Government, and probably your own committee as well. We do this in other areas in relation to employability and other matters, so I would be more than happy to see some sort of joint working party, group, whatever, set up if there is an appetite for that. And as I say, to involve not just the governments but parliamentarians like yourselves as well. We need a fair, affordable welfare system that supports the aims, helps tackle worklessness while ensuring that the most vulnerable get the support that they need. The Joseph Rowntree publication, Monitoring Poverty and Social Exclusion, which featured last weekend, found that child poverty was at its lowest for 25 years. This is consistent with the latest statistics released through the Household Below Average Income Report, June 2013, that also show that relative child poverty is now at its lowest level since the mid-1980s. That's good as far as it goes, but we cannot be complacent. Our economy is still in recovery mode, and if we still have one child in poverty, then that is one too many. I'm conscious that we're all working with the constitutional question as a backdrop, but I don't want it to get in the way of the UK Government working in partnership now with the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government, while we share the levers that can help us respond positively to this challenge. The UK Government on welfare and the economy, the Scottish Government on education, health, skills, childcare and housing. This is a partnership that extends also to local authorities, the third sector and business, as we all do what we need to do to reduce child poverty in Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. Employability is a prime example of where we can work together. The DWP, as part of Universal Credit, is planning to work with 1.6 million in-work claimants to help them progress within the workplace, and in that way to tackle in-work poverty and to deliver financial independence. The Scottish Government can complement this, given their devolved responsibilities for training and skills. And while we are faced with a situation whereby children in the poorest areas of our country can expect to live, on average, 14 years less than children from wealthy areas, addressing health inequalities is clear. using the devolved levers around education to address things like lack of exercise and poor diet. Free school meals featured in the autumn statement, and consequentials from that will flow to the Scottish Government. It's for the Scottish Government to decide whether it wants to seize that opportunity and make a difference, not only in terms of diet, but also with the associated benefits around attainment. Finally, the quality of our environment matters around what we mean by poverty, which is why we need to do all that we can to improve our stock of social housing. The UK Government has already provided in 2011 £1.6 billion for the Decent Homes programme to help local authorities improve social housing. Mr McNeill, in last week's autumn statement, the Government made a series of further announcements that are relevant to our discussion today and which demonstrates action being taken now. As a result of these spending decisions, the Scottish Government will see a significant increase in its budget over the next 2 years, taking the financial consequentials to over £2 billion since autumn of 2010. That is an extra £2 billion to spend on Scottish needs and priorities. The Government has also confirmed that it is making additional funding available for the discretionary housing payments of £40 million across the UK in both 2014 to 15 and 15 to 16 to ensure funding to support those affected by under-occupancy deductions that will not reduce for the next 2 years. There are 138,000 young people in Scotland under the age of 21 whose jobs will be supported by the abolition of employer national insurance contributions. I don't pretend that these are direct answers to addressing the complex challenges of child poverty, but I would suggest that they will help. The coalition government came to power facing unprecedented economic challenges. Employment is the best route out of poverty. A stable economy and growth are essential for job creation. That is the first priority if we are to succeed in tackling child poverty. In the current climate, deficit reduction is not optional in order to build a stable economy. And despite the difficult context, the UK Government has always been clear that it remains committed to ending child poverty. Your own news release, I see, about this inquiry recognises that there are no easy answers, but it's essential that we focus our investment where it can to make the biggest difference. I look forward to our discussion and to the continuing relationship between my government, the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government on what is a matter of fundamental importance to us all. Thank you.
Thank you for your opening statement, and we'll go directly to Aileen McLeod.
Thank you very much, Convener, and also thank you very much to Alistair-Carmichael for your opening remarks. And I note from your remarks that you mentioned about child poverty being an affront, and that you want to see a fair, affordable welfare system, and that obviously that we can't be complacent. So I wanted to start by asking you, just for the record, how many children in Scotland do you believe will be living in poverty by 2020 as a result of the UK Government's welfare reforms and austerity measures?
Well, I mean, you, I suspect, are referring to the figures from the Child Poverty Action Group report, which, is this correct? This is I think they have a 200,000 figure, is it? Is it something of that sort?
No, actually,
no.
the Secretary of State for Scotland is actually 50,000 to 100,000.
Confusing my figures here. 65,000. Now, I drilled down into that when I was preparing for this, and the honest answer is, I think, that nobody really can know, because the figures that the Child Poverty Action Group have come up with are ones which are based on analysis of IFS figures, which are essentially static. That's to say that they make the assumption that we're dealing with everybody remaining on benefits in the way that the benefit system has worked hitherto. The whole point about the migration to universal credit is that it is designed to get people off benefits into work, so that it has a behavioural transformative effect in that respect. And it is that behavioural transformative effect that is very, very difficult to predict outcomes from. If I could just give you one example of the difficulty here. Child Poverty Action Group predicted that the reduction of the number of children in child poverty in the year 11 to 12 would be 100,000. In point of fact, it turned out to be 300,000 because of the other factors that I have outlined already. So, look, I mean, I don't think there's any room for complacency here. I also don't think, though, that to extrapolate figures on the basis of only half the picture is necessarily helpful.
Thank you. I mean, the figures certainly are still pretty shocking when we look at the levels of children that are going to be being pushed into poverty as a result of the UK
That's a bit of an assumption.
But I will also wanted to also highlight to you that there has been a report that was produced a few weeks ago, also from the Deep End Steering Group, which is made up of 360 GPs in some of one of our most deprived areas in Scotland. And they also referenced the Child Poverty Action Group figures, which talk about the 60,000 more children in Scotland that will be pushed into poverty. And they certainly were very critical of the UK government's welfare cuts. And certainly I would recommend that you read a copy of that report, which is a steering group report by the GP Deep End number 21. And also it might be worth, I certainly would recommend you visiting some of the GP health centres in Govan or at least in Drumchapel, where you can at least see firsthand the experience that these Deep End GPs are facing in terms of dealing with the very real kind of mental health and wellbeing challenges that are facing many of our children and families in Scotland. But the next question I wanted to ask you, Mr Carmichael, was if the UK government has made any estimate of the cumulative effect on child poverty of the UK government's welfare cuts.
Well, I mean, I'm always happy to take guidance on diary engagements from anybody, so I'll certainly take that on board. I wonder, just while we're on the subject of the Deep End report, you have the advantage of me, I've not read the report, but does it simply lift the Child Poverty Action Group figures, or does it apply the analysis that I referred to, which is the difference that is taken on by people actually moving from benefit into work?
It references specifically to the Child Poverty Action Group figures.
So they don't apply the analysis that we had, I mean, in which case, I would be delighted, I would be very keen actually to meet with them and to have a discussion along that line, because I think that way you get a rather fuller picture of the actual potential that there is here for progress. I mean, the estimate is that we're expecting something in the region of 300,000 people across the United Kingdom going into work as a result of the introduction of universal credit. So, you know, universal credit, we all know that there are technicalities associated with it, and it's such a radical reform of the whole benefits system. There are always going to be issues with it, but there is enormous potential from the introduction of universal credit to actually make a difference in terms of outcomes at the end of the day. The impact of benefit changes, yes, there are figures from that. I think they would be published along with the autumn statement from last week. I don't have them to hand, but I'll certainly supply the committee with them.
Secretary of State, I mean, your answer would have been more convincing for me if you had a figure that you could have produced. Now, you're quite entitled to disparage the Child Poverty Action figure, but surely, with all the power of government, all the resources of government, embarking on such a significant policy that was going to impact in the way expected, you would have, or the government would have had an expected outcome. And that outcome, if we are serious about child poverty, would have given us a figure whether child poverty was going to increase or decrease. Which is it? Is it going to increase or is it going to decrease?
Let me say, first of all, I have no wish at all to disparage the Child Poverty Action Group. I mean, I am a long-standing admirer of the CPAG. What I'm trying to bring to the committee's attention is the difficulties, which I think the IFS and others would model, would accept that when modelling, the predictability of figures going forward in the future is very, very different. And the reason that I referred to the earlier figures, the figures from 11 to 12, is that that was a forecast that was made 1 year out. So if it's as difficult as that to make a forecast 1 year out...
But are you telling the committee that the UK government has not done any work on the impact of the welfare reform on the levels of child poverty? Or have you some figures you can share with the committee?
If you give me 2 seconds, I've had something that has been pushed into my hand just here. And I don't think it necessarily answers your question, Mr. Chairman.
But in the interest of time, I think the point's been made. Malcolm,
what we do know is that the figures that we have produced, and this is where, my apologies, I was misleading earlier with the 200,000 figure, universal credit is estimated to lift something in the region of 250,000 children out of poverty. So on that basis, I think it is right that the government can say that we are still committed to meeting the 2020 target, and that is a realistic aspiration.
My task, unfortunately, is to get us through this session and get all these people who want in, and I would appreciate sharp questions and sharp and concise answers. Malcolm Chisholm.
Just ask 2 questions. I mean, you've emphasised moving into work, which we all accept, but the reality is more than half the children in poverty are in families that are working. And obviously the big improvements in terms of child poverty were brought about, has to be said, mainly under the last UK government, and tax credits were a key part of the reasons for those improvements. So my first question is about tax credits, because I'm concerned that a lot of people on tax credits are already being worse off in terms of not being uprated with the cost of living. And particularly with reference to childcare, a lot of people who benefited from the 80% disregard, that's reduced to 70%. So I think those changes, just to highlight 2, have meant that many people reliant on tax credits are worse off, and clearly a lot of people in poverty are in that situation. And just to contrast that, many better off families are getting 85% of their childcare costs. So it does seem that the cuts that you are making are affecting disproportionately those that are on the lowest income. And just a final point, many examples could be given of how this will get worse under universal credit. For example, single parents working 16 hours or more, again a key group in terms of child poverty, their earnings disregard will be less generous under universal credit than under working tax credit. So it does seem to me that the emphasis on work is correct, but because tax credits are important to that, the cuts in tax credits for the lowest earning families are a key factor in driving up child poverty.
Well, I mean, can I just come to the point about child tax credits, first of all? Because I think everybody across the political spectrum, some with varying degrees of enthusiasm, thought at the point when they came into force in, 2003, that this was going to be a good and effective way to go. The law of unintended consequences, though, came into play. And the implementation, I still as a constituency MP deal with reclaims of overpayments from the introduction in 2003, because it was an unnecessarily complex and bureaucratic system. And it was meaning that a lot of people weren't getting the benefits to which they were entitled. One of the main drivers of the universal credit is that it brings with it a single point of access to assistance, and it is a much more straightforward process for people to go into. I think the honest assessment, though, was that while the initial impact of child tax credits and reduction of child poverty was good and encouraging, ultimately, as you came into the latter part, from 2005 and 2006 onwards, there was a feeling that their impact had stalled somewhat, and that they weren't delivering the range of changes that, or the rate of progress that was wanted. And I think, quite honestly, that whoever had come into power in 2010, universal credit of some sort, shape or form was going to be, would have been introduced. I mean, I think that's the view from your own front bench at Westminster too.
A second question is about food banks, because I think for me and large number of the population, in a kind of way, they encapsulate all that is going wrong with current poverty policies. And I suppose my question is to you, firstly, how do you account for the great rise in them, and what are you going to do about it? But I mean, I suppose part of that has to be the, as it seems to me, the widespread use of sanctions and the rather draconian sanctions in the benefit system that are even affecting, for example, lone parent families. So I just, I would really like your comments on that, because I think to most people it's totally unacceptable that we're seeing this massive increase in the need for food banks.
Well, I mean, food banks, of course, are not new. You will know that they've been around for some years. One of the things that this government did that the previous government refused to do is that we allowed Job Centre Plus to make people aware of their availability and refer people to them. I share your concern, though. You know, I think their existence and their expansion does cause me concern. There's been one just set up in my own constituency. I'm going to be visiting it at the weekend. And, you know, I think that I come back to the point I made in my opening comments here about the complexity of these issues. And I think it is for government, both here and in Westminster, and probably local government as well, to be talking to those who are running food banks, find out the range and nature of the work that they are having to do, and to see where government assistance might be of help to them. You had, James, you had a point about universal credit, I think.
So yes, I just wanted to come in on the question around childcare and what's happening in universal credit, just to sort of expand slightly on this for the committee. Obviously, you know, one of the fundamental aims of universal credit is to try and make sure that people don't suffer from very, very high withdrawal rates as they move into work or increase their hours. There are some very large cliff edges in the existing system, and in particular around childcare, where essentially a lone parent working up to 16 hours has no access to the childcare element of working tax credit, and then suddenly gets it at 16 hours. So there are sort of two sides to this picture. One is that by smoothing out that sort of process, it's very beneficial for people who are only able to work small numbers of hours. We're hopeful that will help a lot of people to get into work for the first time who aren't able to move straight into 16 hours at a time. But it does mean that some of those big gains, by definition, kind of disappear, because on a cliff edge there are clearly people who are just on the right side of that cliff as opposed to the wrong side of the cliff. So what you have under universal credit is a much smoother system, which kind of gives a much more consistent withdrawal rate for people as they increase their hours and their incomes. And in order to kind of help make that possible, we always said originally we were going to put an extra £200 million into childcare to support that expansion to people working fewer than 16 hours. As you know, we've also said subsequently that we're going to put in an additional £200 million to improve the childcare offer within universal credit alongside the introduction of tax-free childcare. Obviously, clearly wherever systems interact, as the tax-free, the tax system and the childcare credit do, you're still going to have some kind of overlap where the two systems are kind of in parallel with each other. I think what that shows is that actually getting rid of most of those overlapping withdrawals in universal credit is exactly the right thing to do, because these examples do tend to occur where you do have two tapers overlapping. So we're moving in the right direction on that.
I'd say it worked in the opposite direction for single parents working more than 16 hours. But my main point about childcare was they have been withdrawn over the last couple of years. The childcare childcare tax credit was reduced from 80 to 70%, and that has been a key factor in increasing poverty in families over the last couple of years.
I'm asking the committee to follow Malcolm's example and ask those two sharp questions and remind the witnesses again about concise answers if we are to allow. Bob Doris.
Thanks, Convener. I think it's, Mr Rolfe, it's maybe important to put on the record that maybe deal in facts rather than some of the information you were given here. In terms of working tax credit reforms, 12,000 families in Scotland have lost out up to £2,600 a year, and in terms of child tax credit, 73,300 families have lost out £545 a year. Now, that wasn't my question, but you were on at length, Mr Rolfe, about your statistics. I thought we'd deal with the reality that my constituents are facing, and I want to place that on the record, and I'm happy to show the source for that information at a later date if you would wish that. Now, I want to return to the idea of sanctions, and I want to speak about individual cases. Citizens Advice Scotland have made me aware of a case where a client was going to Job Centre Plus and their partner couldn't make the Job Centre Plus appointment because they had a work placement to go to, organised by Job Centre Plus. They were advised they should go to the work placement and not go to the Job Centre interview, but they were still sanctioned and they lost benefits. That's under the new sanctions regime. That's a reality. In 1 year alone, 53,270 sanctions. It would appear to be a gung-ho attitude by Job Centre Plus under the guidance of DWP to take benefits off the most vulnerable people in society. I would like to directly link this to child poverty and directly link this to the growth of food banks. In a 6-month period alone, 23,000 Scots, that's an increase of 19,000 Scots, had to access food banks. That included 7,000 children. Do you accept there's a link between inappropriate sanctions by the DWP on the most vulnerable people in Scotland to the growth in food bank use by children, the people that I represent, the people around this table represent, and will you commit to reviewing the sanctions process because it's clearly not fit for purpose?
Right. I mean, in terms of the actual case that you bring to my attention, I will take that away. In fact, I'm meeting Margaret Lynch from Citizens Advice Scotland this afternoon, so if she's got details of that, then I will certainly take that back to DWP. I would, though, just urge a small measure of caution on you here with regard to the work of Job Centre Plus. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only constituency MP in Scotland who has a good, strong working relationship with the staff of Job Centre Plus in my constituency. I recently visited the staff of the DWP office in Dundee, and I have been impressed enormously by the strength of commitment and the work that they do, often in very difficult circumstances, with some of the most challenging members of our community. So I think that deserves a measure of recognition. Whether there is a direct link between the number of sanctions, I mean, on the basis of what you've described, Mr. Ross, let me tell you, I think that sounds a ridiculous situation. It would be a wholly inappropriate instance for a sanction. So I would have, I wouldn't seek to defend that if that is the situation that has actually transpired here. Whether there is a link between the use of food banks and sanctions, I don't know if you have direct evidence to suggest that there is. We would take it away and look at it. I think there may well be, because sanctions are normally the result of the conduct of the claimant themselves. So, I wouldn't be at all surprised if that was the case. If there are ways of making it work better, then I'm sure that DWP will listen to them.
Secretary of State, I think you in your earlier evidence actually admitted there was a direct link, because you said you'd changed the rules to give direct referrals from the DWP, from Job Centre Plus to food banks. You've effectively institutionalised the process. I would put it to you that 53,270 sanctions, I gave one example. I saw Mr Stewart say there are several others he's aware of and that I'm aware of as well. Can I ask you again, can you commit? Do you have the power to commit, or do you have to ask Mr Laws, who's actually responsible for this area. Do you have the power to commit to a full review of the use of sanctions? And finally, just to put on the record, I've got a wonderful relationship with Job Centre Plus in Glasgow region. They're incredibly helpful, but of course they do have to implement the guidelines and rules that the UK government provides them. So can you commit to a full review of sanctions?
Right, well, first of all, there are no targets and sanctions in relation to benefits. That's just downright wrong.
Mr.
For a review, no, you know that I don't have executive responsibility. You know that's a matter for the Department for Work and Pensions, not even Mr. Laws. I will find out from the Department for Work and Pensions what I would imagine that they have ongoing reviews of these things. I don't know the detail, but I know that virtually every other aspect of welfare benefit policy is under constant review, and I would be astonished if that was not the case as well.
Thank you. Perhaps we can get Mr. Laws to committee at some point to ask him for a formal review of sanctions.
I would have thought that Ian Duncan Smith.
Sorry, you're quite right. Ian Duncan Smith. I was saying Mr. Laws because he's responsible for child poverty. Perhaps we should get them both together to discuss the interaction between sanctions and child poverty.
We need to get your colleagues in as well. Rhoda.
Can I just ask for a point of clarification? You talked about relative child poverty earlier in your opening remarks. I don't know, and you probably don't have this information with you, but it would be helpful to get. Is the number of children in fewer number of children in relative child poverty due to people being poorer on the whole, so therefore incomes have fallen, meaning that less people are relatively in poverty, or is it because incomes have increased for those that were in poverty and people have been lifted?
Well, I mean, there are different reasons for it at different times. You're right, there has been, I think, an overall 8% fall in average incomes, as a consequence of which the barrier at which people fall into relative poverty does shift, all of which does kind of highlight some of the difficulty in relying on figures of that sort for any purpose, because they don't always tell you the whole picture. We can get you some fuller information on that. I mean, I know, for example, part of the increase, part of the improvement in the figures was down to the increase in the year 11 to 12, I think, where inflation was running at 5.2% at the point at which indexation was taken, was fixed. But thereafter inflation fell quite steeply over the succeeding year when the money was actually being paid. So there are all these sort of factors that can have an influence. I think, though, it comes back to my overall point, and that is that you can do so much by changing benefits, working with credits here, all the rest of it, but actually to make a difference, the transformative difference to people's lives and young people's lives in particular, then what is necessary is to get people off benefits and into work.
Okay, I'd appreciate more information on that. Can I just move on to sanctions, as colleagues were talking about, and I won't repeat what they were saying other than to say that I have had cases in from citizens' advice where sanctions appear to have been misused and used inappropriately, which has driven people to food banks and the like, and it would be useful to have a closer look at that. But can I ask if Job Centre Plus has given advice on how to implement sanctions when there are children in the family? It seems to me unfair, regardless of the circumstances, that a child's income is impacted on by the actions of their parents, whether or not that was fair or unfair in the first place. What is the minimum income for a family with a child in it that they need to get to make sure that that child is fed and cared for?
James, do you have information?
I mean, we might need to sort of both come in on this, but in terms of the specific issue of sanctions, I want to be really clear for the committee in terms of what the DWP policy on this is. I mean, first and foremost, there are no targets for sanctions. The position is made clear to our staff that sanctions are to be used as a last resort. There is a hardship regime that is in place where a sanction is applied because it might cause hardship to the family and the children for precisely the point that you describe. Clearly, it is of concern when we hear about sanctions being misapplied, which on the face of it is sounds very likely in the case that you've described. And that is something that I will quite happily sort of take back and discuss with colleagues back in DWP. But the policy position is absolutely clear. The one thing I just wanted to add on that is that one of the things that we're doing alongside universal credit, as you probably know, is bringing in something called the claimant commitment, which is designed to give a much more sort of clear statement between the department and the individual of exactly what's expected from them in return for receiving their benefit, whether that's universal credit or job seekers allowance. And the initial analysis from the sort of universal credit areas is that people actually find the claimant commitment a lot easier to understand and operate with in terms of understanding what they have to do. So, I will go away and happy to sort of investigate individual examples, but there is work in train in the department to try and make sure that we can be as clear as we possibly can with people so they know what they have to do, they understand and accept that what they have to do is reasonable, and that we avoid any situation like you've described where, sanctions are applied in an inappropriate circumstance.
My question wasn't so much about that, but what is the minimum income, less sanctions that a family would get if there are children in that family?
Have we got that figure?
I don't know the precise figure. I know that the elements for children are protected from the sanctions, but I'm not entirely sure what the exact figure is.
Something you mentioned, the hardship. Can you expand on that? Does that cover Rhoda Grant's point?
Yeah. Can I suggest that perhaps we provide a written submission on this, because there are a number of elements to this. There's the amount of the sanction, the elements of the benefit that are sanctioned, and those that are protected from a sanction, and then additionally there's the question of hardship and whether an additional payment can be made. So perhaps if I send through the detailed rules rather than try and describe them now.
That would be helpful, and maybe also the criteria where sanctions are used, because what we're getting back and what appears to be coming out from government are absolutely different.
I mean, it's worth saying the use of sanctions is not new. This has been something that's been part of the benefit system for as long as I've been a Member of Parliament. And yes, sometimes they are used inappropriately. Sometimes they are used in a way that has unnecessarily draconian consequences. It all, again, in my experience, often comes back to the sheer complexity of the benefit system. Anything that simplifies that leaves both the job centre plus staff and the claimants in a clearer position about where they respectively stand, I think has got to be good.
The important point that members have made about the 126% increase in the sanctions have been used, and we're particularly concerned in terms of our evidence as well, Secretary of State. We have heard the impact of these sanctions on families, and the strong point was made by Rhoda Grant.
I see the impact myself every week in my own communities. I'm not blind to it.
We need to see how we can deal with that. Richard Lyle.
Morning, Secretary of State. You said a minute ago you want people off benefits and into work. We've got a national minimum wage of £6.31. We've got a living wage of £7.45. Would you not agree with me that child poverty is also linked to the factor of whilst people, go into work, but they are getting a very low pay? And every year since 2008, the national minimum wage has failed to keep up with the cost of living. Why is that? And basically, the wage is this national minimum wage would be no higher in 2017 than its value in 2004. Would the government commit to raising the national minimum wage by at least inflation? And do you have a plan for tackling low pay? At the end of the day, and sorry for the pop, if MPs are going to get 11% an increase, why shouldn't people on the national minimum wage, or even people on living wage, get a decent increase? Because the point I made a couple of weeks ago to one of our witnesses, if you actually paid more, and she replied, if you pay more, it's good for your business, it's good for your reputation in the community, you'll get more customers because people will see you as an ethical employer. If people get a decent wage or a better wage, would that not make the economy better?
Right. I mean, I think just to pick up that last point there, I think that's absolutely right. I don't know if you picked up, but my colleague Mark Harper, who's the Minister for Immigration, made exactly that point to the Chief Executive, I think, of Domino's Pizzas just the other day. And in fact, we are already working on this. My colleague Vince Cable commissioned the Low Pay Commission to look at this and to come back with proposals. We're expecting the report on that, I think, by the end of 2014. Sorry, the end of February for 2014, I beg your pardon. Now, there are other things that can be done, though, in relation to low pay, not just increasing the minimum wage. One of the things that we have has made a real difference since 2010 has been the raising of the threshold at which you start to pay income tax. That has gone from just something over 6,000. By 2015, it will be 10,000. Now, that has the greatest impact on the people who are on the lowest incomes, because that is taking some people out of paying tax altogether. The fact that we'll get to 10,000 by 2015 is something that we were told could never be done, but we will have done it. I think there's potential to go beyond that. And, I mean, this is not government policy, but it would certainly be my aspiration that over the next Parliament we make further progress in that respect. And I think that the minimum wage as it currently stands, to have a full-time job on the minimum wage takes you to about 12,500. I would think it would be a reasonable aspiration for the next government from 2015 to 20 to take that whole 12,500 out of paying tax. I think that would be a signal that would be as clear as you could get about the value that is placed by government on people getting into work. On the question of 11% MP wage rises, I couldn't agree with you more. I made it very clear earlier this week that for as long as there is public sector pay restraint, I'm not going to be taking that 11%. It is something I understand actually that is to be reviewed by IPSA immediately following the 2015 election. And of course, I would never be so presumptuous as to take my voters in Orkney and Shetland for granted as to assume that I will necessarily be the MP for Orkney and Shetland in 2015, but I'm hopeful. I have just been reselected by my local party. But I think it is important that people in positions like myself are prepared to make gestures of that sort. For that reason, in fact, although I've not been killed in the stampede of people wanting to thank me for it, we took a 5% cut to ministerial and MP salaries in the coalition government in 2010 and then froze the level of MP and ministerial salaries throughout this Parliament.
Would you not agree with me that you made a figure 12,500 as a wage is a poor wage, and that's why a lot of people who do want to get off the benefits and do want to have a job, but 12,500 at the end of the day is not a great wage?
Well, it's not a great wage, and that's why I think for the government still to be wanting to take a big chunk out of it, it is, at the very least undesirable. You might even say unacceptable. Now, of course, there's a cost that goes along with this, but I think that you take a measure like that, which has already made a significant difference to people's lives who are in low-paid work. And I've worked in the hotel catering industry before I trained as a solicitor. I've done low-paid jobs. I know what it's like living on a kitchen assistant's wage or a waiter's wage, because it's not easy. And I think that for the government to send the signal that actually we know that this is difficult for you, so we're not going to be taking the money off you, would be as strong an encouragement to get people into work as you would get.
Thank you.
Thank you. With all due respect,
Sorry.
you don't know what it's like to be in a life stuck and trapped in low pay. I don't think any of us do here. So the big difference being having that for life as doing it as a student or something.
No. Well, no, sorry. Just for the record, Mr McNeill, I've worked full-time as a waiter and
You've
as
done
a kitchen
well.
assistant.
You've done well.
You're very kind.
We're in the last 10 minutes due to the Chamber business, and I've got Gil and I've got Colin. and then obviously come to our visitors. Gil.
Well, I can admit to living in poverty, and I'm no ashamed of it, to be quite honest. I know how it is. Lived through it for a long, long time when I was very young, so I know all about it. There's a question you raised in your preamble, Secretary of State for Scotland, and you mentioned additional money for the Scottish budget. Now, I know you're a lawyer before you entered politics. I'm in business, and in business, if you took £10 from me and gave me back one, the one wouldn't be additional, would it?
No, absolutely not.
Fine,
I mean,
okay.
that's why I said from autumn 2010.
Right, that's maybe because when you're a lawyer and you ask 2 lawyers a question, you get back 3 invoices, the way that you guys do the counting.
I no longer have to defend the practices of the Law Society of Scotland.
Yeah, it's not quite. Can I get back to the real substance of this? And I want to talk briefly on the gender impact. And you know, many of the benefits the universal credit replaces previously went to carers of children, namely women. And you know, the universal credit is now going to go to in one single household payment. Now, the impact of that, and let's not kid ourselves, it's going to get into the hands of men. And we know the history that some men, in this case, they never pass that money to the main carer, who's a woman. So my question is quite straightforward. What are you going to do to guard against this happening? We know that one element of this policy you have is definitely going to increase in a negative way the gender impact, and it's also going to adversely affect, we know it, there's no question about it, it's going to affect the poorest in society, and that's a child in a household like that.
Well, I mean, what we do know is that it's something in the region of 7% of cohabiting couples and 2% of married couples who actually manage their finances separately. So, you know, whether that would be the case or not, I'm not entirely sure. But there will be support for those who need support in adjusting to this particular change in the system. And again, I speak, you know, with some passion from my own background, having been involved with the Women's Aid movement in Aberdeenshire before I was elected, where there is instances of domestic violence. Then the arrangements will be composed differently in order that the position of any victim of domestic violence will not be made worse by virtue of the single household payments.
I'm refreshed to hear that you're looking at one sector of it, which is it's a problem across society. You don't need to be poor to be to be beat up by your partner.
Oh no, indeed, yes.
But my question was, we're not talking about domestic violence. We're talking about the impact on children who are living in a household who the man is likely to take the money, maybe drink it, drugs, spend it elsewhere, but the child never sees it. What are you going to do to ensure that that doesn't happen? What ring fence, what guard are you going to do for that?
What I'm saying is that I don't think that there's actually many meaningful ring fences there at the moment. I don't think even that putting benefits to people individually, because I mean the figures are there. Those who are not married but cohabiting, only 7% manage their finances separately, and 2% of married couples now apparently manage their finances separately. So, look, I know that what you're saying here, Mr. Patterson, has a substantial degree of truth in it. I don't think, though, that you change that by something as mechanistic as a payment to one partner or another. You know, you're talking about something that is by no means uncommon in Scottish society today, regrettably. But, you know, in the sort of situation that you're describing, which is effectively an abusive relationship, the fact that the money is paid to the wife is absolutely no guarantee that she gets to keep it. I think we both know the truth of that.
Well, I'm aware you need to let folk in. I'll let it go at that.
Thanks, Gil. Thanks for your indulgence. Colin?
Thanks. Just going back just a little bit when you were talking about the tax allowances, Secretary of State, and how you were going to be raising the tax allowances, but what does that do for the people who are under the allowances set at this minute in time? Because so far you've gone through the process of saying that stuff like universal credit that's been described as obviously straightforward, but you earlier said there was technicalities and
technicalities with the implementation,
yes,
not with the application from the
yeah.
point of view of the claimant.
But what's in effect happening, I mean, obviously the first question is that there's nothing about the raising of the tax thresholds that affect those who are under it already. And with the difficulties you've got with the likes of the implementation, the problems that have been put forward by my colleagues earlier in terms of sanctions and whatever, and even to find one person coming out at a meeting referring to the local DWP office as Lourdes because you went in disabled and came out without your benefits. Don't you think that there is certainly, maybe not in your mind, but certainly in others' mind, that this benefit system that has been put together in this form is really nothing more than a bit of a shambles so far?
The question, first of all, on the help that is available to people who are earning beneath the threshold for paying income tax is that at the moment you have tax credits. In the future you will have universal credit to give them the help that they need. It's worth bearing in mind that in Scotland alone it's estimated there will be something in the region of 300,000 households that will be on average £166 a month better off as a result of the introduction of universal credit. Now, I mean, I think that is a significant sum. I think it's something that you would be ill-advised to dismiss too lightly. One of the reasons why I was very concerned, actually, to see in the white paper that apparently it's the intention of the Scottish Government, if they have the power to do so, to walk away from the implementation of universal credit completely. I think that would be a highly regressive step. Now, I think it's wrong, though, to conflate an issue like that with the implementation of sanctions. If there is a problem with the implementation of sanctions, then that can be taken away, it can be looked at, it can be dealt with. But, you know, again, I would urge a measure of caution towards this. You know, when people like you and I talk about these things, it is listened to and it's heard, and it has an impact on the Job Centre Plus staff and the way that people who are making claims, who are working in very difficult circumstances, sometimes with very challenging individuals, and how they are treated. So I would just urge you that one small measure of caution.
I would say that I'm not apportioning blame to any member of the staff.
Your reference, though, to Job Centre Plus as being Lourdes, I don't think that's helpful.
No, but I think it's helpful to know the stuff that comes across my desk as a constituency MSP. I think it's fair to say. I mean, but your own analysis, the Treasury's own analysis in the autumn statement, according to CPAG, since 2010, if the implementation comes through, we're looking at the worst off, or the poorest families will be £880 worse off. Now,
I'm sorry,
well, that's what
coming from?
CPAG claimed the autumn statement and the effects from 2010
from
come through the policies. So yeah, but
Right.
that's what you're talking about in terms of the length of time that this has been going on with the various.
Agree, Colin. If there's a dispute about those figures, we can get something back. I've got 5 minutes to allow our visitors in here.
Right, okay.
And I need to share that between them. Go right up to the wire. Jackie Bailey.
The question requires a simple yes or no answer, if that's possible. The Secretary of State, the majority of parties in the Scottish Parliament, will be no surprise to you, are against the bedroom tax. Ever the optimist, I wonder at the prospect of you repealing it because it is substantially aggravating child poverty. In the event you don't, we'll pursue mitigation. We're asking the Scottish Government to spend £50 million of their budget to fully mitigate the policy. Danny Alexander, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, told a meeting of conveners in this Parliament that there was nothing to stop the Scottish Government from doing so. They had the power, it was their choice, and the UK Government would not claw that back. Is Danny Alexander right, or is Margaret Burgess right?
Well, I would never contradict Danny Alexander, especially not on a matter as detailed as that. I understand actually that Danny has been in correspondence with some of your Scottish Parliament colleagues. I think that may be in the public domain or not, but my understanding is that that is the position.
Thank you very much.
Kevin Stewart. Thank you, Convener. I'm glad to hear the Secretary of State in his opening remarks saying that he would like to see greater interaction between his colleagues at Westminster and here. He may wish to talk to Ian Duncan-Smith and the Lord Freud and persuade them to appear formally in front of this Parliament's Welfare Reform Committee, which they've refused to do thus far. Convener, both Aileen Campbell and Mr Carmichael talked about attainment, and attainment bringing folk out of poverty. Mr Carmichael's Cabinet colleague Michael Gove, the UK Education Secretary, has said that children should have rooms of their own in which to do their homework and achieve their full potential. Here in Scotland, we have 15,500 families with children affected by the bedroom tax, who I think deserve a room of their own. Does Mr Carmichael agree?
Well, of course, the purpose of the changes to the housing benefit occupancy regulations is to get a better fit between the housing stock and the families that require to occupy it. So one of the upshots of that should be that there is more housing stock available that is more appropriate to the needs of families that are then going to be occupying it. And I mean, I think Michael Gove is absolutely right about this point about attainment. And I think it's one of the things that has informed.
But do you agree, Mr Carmichael, that each of these children who should have a room of their own? These kids, these poor kids affected by the bedroom tax, should they be given the same opportunities as others? Yes or no? It's that simple.
They will not get a room of their own.
Yes or no?
If the housing stock is not there available for them, if it is under-occupied. And this, if I may say so...
But these are children who are already in homes with rooms.
This is a tactic that I'm becoming increasingly familiar with, being talked over when I start to give an answer that they don't particularly like.
You're not giving an answer, that's the problem.
If I can explain for the benefit of the committee, the power to manage housing stock lies already within the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government. And you see this across the piece. There are a number of areas where, in fact, the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government could make real progress in delivering the sort of service which will make a real difference to young people, to lift them out of child poverty. This is just one of them. Housing stock is one of them. Another is the question of childcare. The Scottish Government already has power to deliver the childcare policies that they say are necessary. The fact is, though, that they have not actually, they've not taken...
Mr Stewart, you would not put up with that at your committee. Now, I'm giving you an opportunity to come back in when the Secretary of State completes his answer. So don't, you know...
On child poverty, the fact of the matter is that the Scottish Government already has substantial powers on housing, on childcare, for example. And the money is already there because they've had the Barnett consequentials on childcare. They have chosen not to bring it up to the same level of provision that there is in England.
Mr Stewart's got the last minute of this committee, which he's a visitor at this morning. So
thank you, Convener. Mr Carmichael didn't answer my question. I'll ask him another one. He mentioned the victims of domestic abuse. Should victims of domestic abuse have to suffer the consequences of the bedroom tax? Yes or no?
No, they shouldn't. And I would say that, you know, that's why a government that spends its time dreaming of independence would be better advised to get on and deliver with the powers they've got under devolution.
Will you scrap the bedroom tax?
Mr Stewart, we'll discuss this after this meeting closes. The parliamentary rules, Secretary of State...
I understand.
means that we've got to close the meeting at this point, and that put additional pressure on. But we appreciate your visit here, and if you stay behind, I would like to pick you up on some of the earlier remarks about how we could work together.
I'm more than happy to do that.
Thanks. Thank you.